It's going to be a half-hour session, and we are going to have our very own Sarah presenting, and then that is going to be followed by Suren, and I'm sure you're all looking forward to his presentation. And I think this session is very much about how we intertwine quality improvement with sustainability. And, you know, we've talked about that a lot over the past few months, and I think Suren is going to be able to demonstrate where this has worked incredibly well. So I'm really keen to hear how that has worked in nephrology. So without further ado, I am going to open up to Sarah. Are you sharing your slides, Sarah?
Yes, I'm hoping so.
Do you want, yeah, slideshow.
Is that
As
okay?
all, yeah, I was just going to say to everybody, as always, if you've got any questions or you want to comment, please use the chat function. We very much encourage interactive sessions. So take it away, Sarah.
Lovely, thanks, Jo. Me and Suren have sort of tag teamed today's session because we want to do a bit about sustainability and QI, and we thought it would be really helpful to just start at the beginning with a bit about how it all fits together. So quality improvement and sustainability do go hand in hand, and I've put a couple of the logos there from the SHINE team, the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, and our own Newcastle Improvement logo. What I've found over the past few months is that very much the same language is used throughout, and it's really important that we don't forget that they are the same thing and they can be one together. So it was just to sort of bring this all together into one place. As you probably already know, the model for improvement is what we use on a regular basis when we're looking at QI and how we approach QI. And Suren is going to demonstrate brilliantly how he's used this alongside, don't pull a face like that, Suren, how he's used this alongside a sustainable project. And it was just sort of a bit of a reminder about, you know, there's 3 questions, thinking about what your aim is, what your measurement is, and what your change ideas are, and making sure that you try and test those changes using PDSA cycles. I also wanted to have a quick look at our hexagon as well. I just want to say as well that, you know, quality is evident throughout all of these, but the bit that we want to focus on today is about the environmental sustainability. So thinking about potentially the carbon footprint per outpatient appointment or inpatient stay, the environmental impact of transport of staff and goods, and this is all going to become very apparent through the QI project that Suren's done. I want to show an example of a project that we have had presented here before, which was a really, really nice way of showing the sustainable angle. And it was the Hadrian Toileting Programme, which was a team that Julia from our team coached through as well. And it was the nursing team at the Hadrian School looking at toileting and delays with achieving continence. And they looked at education and a toileting programme. And what came out of that QI project was every child made progress through the toileting stages, increased quality of life for patient and family. Children weren't using containment products anymore, and there was a cost saving of up to £190 in 12 weeks for each family, which was huge. But this QI project actually then had that sustainable side, which wasn't what they'd actually gone to do in the first place. But the environmental impact was that actually 2,548 containment products were saved from landfill. And there was also 229 kilograms of CO2 saved from the atmosphere, which is the equivalent of driving 1,000 miles in a small petrol car. So actually, it had a huge impact from a sustainable point of view. But that's not what that team set out to do in the first place. They set out on a QI project that was really, really patient focused, wanting to make a difference to parents and the children. But actually, the sustainable angle that came out of it was fantastic. So I suppose one of the main messages that Suren and I want to get out of today for you is that you can tackle sustainability by using a quality improvement approach, but also to start thinking about doing a QI project, but think about how you can tackle sustainability within it. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Suren.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'm hoping that you can see my screen now. So I'll just get it on slideshow. Yeah, so thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to speak to you all today. Now, it's not too great a stretch to state that the most important legacy we might leave, not just future, but current patients, will be resilient and sustainable services on our habitable planet. But it's becoming increasingly clear that that task is becoming more and more difficult with each passing day. So although my remit is to give you a briefing of some of the SUS-QI work, and Sarah's, basically set us up for a fall, basically, because I think some of the lessons that we've learned have got some negatives as well as positives, but we'll share those shortly. But I first want to kind of pan back out and give you some context. So first, do no harm is one of the basics of clinical practice, as you all know. So we'll clearly apply this at the level of the individual patient. Now, we should be applying this at the level of society as well, when we're developing clinical services that should be inclusive and accessible rather than exclusive and inaccessible to all but a few. But we've also got obligations to apply this at the level of the planet. And the scale of the task bears re-emphasizing. So the iconic image that you'll see on the left there is of the Genbaku Dome in Hiroshima in the aftermath of the atomic bombing. And you can take your pick of apocalyptic imagery, but the rate at which Earth is accumulating energy as a result of greenhouse gas emissions has been estimated as the equivalent of detonating 13.3 Hiroshima bombs a second. Now, you can read up on some of the workings in this non-peer-reviewed blog linked in the red text at the bottom of the slide. But the problem almost literally boils down to the fundamentals of thermodynamics, the Earth energy imbalance, or heat in, heat out. So if these metrics hold true, healthcare, using figures that we'll touch on shortly, is contributing 35 Hiroshima's worth of energy to this imbalance a minute. Now, the real world impacts of all this play out in the headlines, as you'll see on the right there. And all of these have been taken from within the last 12 days. And it also includes an acknowledgement just at the bottom right here that the environmental crisis that we face is multifaceted. It's not just about global heating. It's about pollution, single-use plastics, antibiotics getting into the environment, etc., etc. So, in fact, to gain a perspective on healthcare and its contribution to the environmental crisis, we also need to recognise that it's consumption, not population as such, which is the fundamental problem for all sectors, not just health. So the impact that greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental strains are placing on the planet illustrated in something called Earth Overshoot Day. So that's the day of the year on which Earth's carrying capacity, so-called capacity to meet our resource requirements and deal with our waste, is exceeded. And it was the 2nd of August this year. Now, if we were acting in perfect balance with the Earth, it would be the 31st of December. However, if everybody consumed as we do in the UK, and that's highlighted at 4 o'clock on this dial here, Earth Overshoot Day would have been the 19th of May this year. So we see inequities by country, but the same applies to those of us across the globe in the top 10% of personal wealth. And so that's at the lip of the martini glass here. So we're responsible for 50% of so-called lifestyle emissions, and that's coming from our heating, lighting, food, transport, clothes, and other goods. So fairly basic stuff here. And if you're wondering what those 10% look like, if you've got net assets of 70k, £70,000, mostly in the form of our houses, that would land you in this top 10% of high emitters. So where does healthcare fit into all of this? Now, Healthcare Without Harm are a global organisation that seeks to reduce healthcare's climate impact or environmental impact. And back in 2019, they published this freely available report. You can get it through this URL here, that provided the first ever global estimate of healthcare's climate footprint. And that was based on full global coverage of spend, together with a more of a deep dive into 43 individual countries, including the UK and the EU. And it identified kind of key sources of healthcare emissions to allow comparisons between countries and between different regions. So its headline figures were that 4.4% of global net emissions, that's about 2 gigatons or 2,000 million metric tons CO2 equivalent per year, were attributable to our activities in healthcare across the globe. So put another way, if the health sector were combined into a single country, it would be the 5th largest emitter on the planet. Now, the top emitters were predictably US, China, and EU. But when you broke this down to per capita emissions, China dropped into a much, much lower tier. Now, it's worthwhile having to think about carbon literacy, something that we need to get rapidly familiar with, and we need to bust some jargon as well. And in this case, emissions scope. Now, emissions related to any activity, healthcare, industry, government, whatever, can be broken up three ways. So using healthcare as an example, scope 1 emissions, that's right in the centre there, come directly from healthcare facilities. So our on-site generators, the CHP plant at the Freeman, for instance, and also our healthcare-owned vehicles. Scope 2 emissions are indirect and come from the energy that we buy in, the residual energy that we'll get in from the national grid or other regional energy sources. Scope 3 emissions are everything else, and they largely come from supply chain, from the production, transport, disposal of goods such as drugs, the kit that we use, and food. The report showed that the vast majority of emissions, 71%, shown here, were derived from the supply chain with scope 3 emissions, and that a quarter of all emissions were actually generated outside the country in which that healthcare was being delivered, illustrating the global nature of the problems that we face. There's no point in looking at individual country emissions when we're outsourcing so much of our manufacture to other countries. So another bit of carbon jargon to be busted is the use of the term CO2e. That stands for CO2 equivalents. So greenhouse gas emissions are converted to CO2 equivalents by multiplying each gas by its 100-year global warming potential, its GWP 100. That's the amount of warming that 1 tonne of the gas would create relative to 1 tonne of CO2 over a 100-year time frame. So taking as an example, methane, the GWP 100 of methane is 25. So the emission of 1 tonne of methane is equivalent to the 100-year impact of 25 tonnes of CO2. And just for interest, the GWP 100 of desflurane, which has now been decommissioned from the NHS, it's an anaesthetic gas, is 2,540. But longevity has an impact as well. So methane has a relatively lower 100-year impact because it's cleared pretty quickly, while CO2 is a real keeper. For every tonne of CO2 emitted, 1/3 will still be hanging around in the atmosphere in 33,000 years' time. So Healthcare Without Harm followed up that first report with the second one from 2021 that presented global and country-specific roadmaps to healthcare decarbonisation. So healthcare emissions are growing, and in their business as usual projections, and that's the top trajectory that you'll see here, Healthcare Without Harm predicted that these would have tripled from the current level of 2,000 million metric tonnes, that's 2 gigatons, by 2050. The blue wedge in this projection, in theory, should be resolved if progress is made in line with government's energy and climate commitments made up to 2017. But that's now a really moot point given the rollback that we're seeing on net zero recently. But assuming that we regain ground here at a civic level, at a governmental level, we're still left with this purple wedge for us to tackle further opportunities for healthcare decarbonisation. The yellow wedge represents uncharted territory, but we can break that purple wedge down a little bit further in this next slide, as shown here. Now, there are 3 pathways that cut across 7 individual actions. So the 3 pathways are to decarbonise ourselves, to decarbonise our supply chains, and importantly, advocate and influence for wider decarbonisation. We as working in healthcare have got powerful voices that society do listen to. So the 7 modelled high impact actions listed down the right include zero emissions drives across power, infrastructure and transport, getting circularity built into healthcare, and establishing and maintaining healthcare effectiveness. But even with full execution of these high impact interventions, we're still going to be left with a 1,000 million metric tonne deficit here. And suggested solutions to this include addressing the societal and environmental determinants of health that we're all increasingly aware of. So the nation-specific roadmaps recognise that we've all got different responsibilities and capabilities. So a country like the UK, and that's shown in the graph on the right here, would be expected to follow this steep decline here in orange, whereas a lower income setting, you might actually see the emissions rise as healthcare is equalised across their societies. So how does this reflect the ambitions of the NHS itself? Now, set against the 1990 baseline, NHS England was the first health system in the world to commit to firm net zero targets. And these were firstly the emissions under direct control. That's the scope 1 and 2 emissions. What we generate on site, what we emit from our vehicles would be reduced to net zero by 2040, with an ambition for an 80% reduction by 28 to 32. And that latter is really critical to prevent us from kicking the can down the road for future generations. Now, the second target, NHS Carbon Footprint Plus, incorporates the wider supply chain with a net zero target of 2045 and the ambition for an 80% reduction by 36 to 39. Newcastle hospitals, incidentally, have much more ambitious targets than that. Now, nephrology is one of the most damaging specialties to the environment in the range of different services that we supply, with one estimate suggesting that our patients have a carbon footprint 18 times higher than the NHS England average. But as well as a long history of action at local level, green nephrology was cemented at a strategic level with the setting up in late 2021 of the Sustainable Kidney Care Programme of our multi-professional body, the UK Kidney Association. And it's worthwhile panning out a little bit to examine one of its most important early actions, and that was to define 2 high-level goals. So target 1 is non-contentious, to meet or exceed NHS carbon net zero goals. Target 2 is less mainstream. That's to meet or exceed goals for circularity in kidney care. And we've adopted similar timeframes to NHS Carbon Footprint Plus, and we reward solutions that demonstrably shift processes further higher up the waste hierarchy, away from recycling to reuse minimisation, prevention of use, and that also shift the onus for waste management away from the end users, from the hard-pressed front line. And it's worthwhile asking yourselves whether your own professional bodies and organisations have their own environmental targets to act as a starting point in your aims for your own SUS-QI journeys. Now, sustainable kidney care in Newcastle's got a long history, and back in 2012, we won the National Green Nephrology Award for this bulk recycling project, and you'll see some familiar faces there. And this was scalable across the trust. But some of the initiatives we've undertaken listed down the left are listed here, some successful, some less so for a range of reasons. But if we're being totally transparent, these boil down to 3 broad themes. Firstly, our own limited capacity to undertake and sustain these projects. This is snatched moment stuff for us. Secondly, and linked to this, is the general assumption that sustainable healthcare is a nice to have, but not essential business. And thirdly, there's at least from our point of view, there was a lack of joined up sustainability strategy, with each component, clearly linking in to the overall aim. So now sustainable healthcare is a standing agenda item at renal unit business meetings. It's worthwhile knowing whether this is the case in your departments too, incidentally. We've now got overarching aims guided by our national body on which to base our strategy. And finally, recognising that most of us are working in the field, who are working in the field, have no dedicated time for this. We need to look for opportunity. That's the opportunity to wedge ourselves into, other routine business. So procurement, for instance. So we've had a heavy sustainability footprint within the hemodialysis machine replacement programme when we replaced our main water plant as well. But for instance, for yourselves, QI and SUS-QI are not separate entities. So where other QI projects do not consider sustainability, consider raising a challenge. So data is all important. And just last year, we published this this report of the carbon footprint of our in-centre hemodialysis service. That's here at the Freeman, conducted together with the Sustainable Healthcare Coalition. And they're a key interface with the supply chain. So in contrast to previous published work, we were able to get information on emissions directly from industry because of this relationship, and we're able to estimate a per patient carbon footprint of nearly 3.4 tonnes CO2 equivalent per year. And to put this in understandable terms, this is the same as asking each and every one of our dialysis patients to drive their own medium-sized petrol car, single occupancy, all the way to Middlesbrough and back 3 times a week. So the biggest components of this are energy, that's from CHP, patient travel, and the manufacture and transport of the various pharmaceuticals and consumables that we use. But we then used our methodology to develop a carbon calculator for in-centre hemo, and that's available through this URL here. And people around the globe are now using this to baseline their own services, but also to judge the impact of interventions. So we're now near completion of another type of dialysis, peritoneal dialysis, the life cycle assessment. We'll be building out a carbon calculator from this. And then we intend to spread this across the whole of our renal service, building out care pathways and establishing carbon calculators for each of them. So with this work in hand, we can now apply our natural aims, that's here on the left, to in-centre hemodialysis. We could have similar driver diagrams for home hemodialysis, for peritoneal dialysis, transplantation, etc., etc. But this driver diagram, constructed for the Freeman hemodialysis unit on Ward 31, has primary drivers comprising utilities, materials, waste, travel, and people. The overconsumption seems to be a really obvious secondary driver to start with, and a switch to autoflow, which we'll hear about shortly, was felt by us to be the quickest of wins to ease our group into the SUS-QI journey and allow me to present you with a fait accompli and a blaze of glory, or so we thought. But first, to understand autoflow, we need to know that standard global practice is to prescribe a dialysis fluid flow rate, that's the cleaning fluid flow rate through the machines, or QD, at about 500 to 800 mils per minute at each session. Now, these flow rates and other components of the hemodialysis prescription can be tweaked, can be manipulated to deliver what we call adequate dialysis with sufficient toxin clearances. And one way of measuring those toxin clearances is with something called the urea reduction ratio, or the URR, which should be at least 65%. Now, some modern dialysis machines, including our recently replaced machine fleet, have a function called autoflow. That's pre-programmed in as the machine default, and it requires a manual override by the dialysis nurse to program in a specific dialysis fluid flow rate. And this is our current practice, in common with standard global practice. So there is a small published literature, a scattering of case studies and some positive anecdotes from other renal units suggesting that dialysis fluid flow rates may well be excessive for the QB, or the blood flow rate. And that's especially so when you're getting rubbish blood flows from poorly functioning vascular access. Now, excessive dialysis flow rates are a bad thing because it means more purified water needing to be generated by our energy intensive water plant, and it means more chemicals to make up that final dialysis fluid solution, all of which end up just heading straight down the drain with no impact on patient well-being. So autoflow basically adjusts the dialysis fluid rate, the QD, according to the actual blood flow rate that you get on the day, rather than the blood flow rate that we would hope for. And we know that often they're really quite different. Now, for standard hemodialysis, that's HD here, the default factor in our machines is 1.5. So at a QB, that's a blood flow of 300, the QD will be automatically adjusted to 450. This is with autoflow in place. If the QB was increased to 350, because the dialysis nurse found that the act was actually turning out to work well, the QD would be automatically uplifted to 525. So I think you get the concept. Now, both standard hemodialysis and hemodiafiltration, HDF, are performed through the same machine, but with different tubing sets, so the machine knows whether you're delivering HD or HDF. For the purposes of this talk, HDF is basically an enhanced form of standard dialysis. And the default autoflow setting for HDF, if the machine's in HDF mode, is 1.2, not 1.5. So I think you get the picture that you know, we're basically trying to limit with autoflow the overconsumption of fluid and chemicals. And manual overrides allow programming in of a specific QD if you really want to. But for our first PDSA cycle, we adopted a much more cautious approach in just 6 patients. Autoflow factors rather higher than other people had been using, pre-programmed as new defaults in the machines that we were using in that particular bay before the trial started in June. But in a fit of perhaps cautiousness, we also required the dialysis nurses to manually override the QD to over 500 if autoflow corrected to less than this. So if you had a low QB, the QD would, and the QD was less than 500, the nurse would have to override that and program in 500. So what actually happened? Well, we had some confusion, obviously, about the manual override. There were a lot of staff moving in and out of that bay, so maintaining consistency with this new technique it wasn't quite as watertight as we wanted to. And most patients did actually require that override because of poor blood flows. The URR was stable and did not change, so we decided in PDSA2 to pull out all the stops and go for the manufacturer's recommendations with no minimum QD, that's no manual override, much easier to train up as there was a consistent approach for all patients and for all nursing staff. However, as shown over on the bottom left, the numbers actually achieving our target URR or failing to achieve it rose from 47 prior to the start of the trial to 74 after it had started. So we were clearly failing to deliver adequate dialysis to many more of our patients. And the most likely culprit was poor vascular access. And unfortunately, in our practice, we have extremely high use of tunnel dialysis catheters, which are a very poor second best to AV fistulas in terms of blood flow, but obviously which patients prefer because it doesn't involve needles. So poor blood flows from highly prevalent catheters requiring immediate mitigation. Now, what the machine manufacturers would say is that you need to extend the dialysis time. That's not very popular with patients. They would also recommend that we increase the size of our dialyzers, and that's not very popular with us from an environmental perspective. It's more plastic, more carbon emissions, the bigger and bigger the dialysis machines get. So what we've done is reintroduce these higher autoflow factors and reintroduced a manual override as well. So to summarize, what we've found is an apparently straightforward quick win just to ease ourselves into SysQI, and as recommended by the manufacturer utilized in other units, proving a bit more complex than anticipated because of specific local circumstances, kind of justifying the structured approach of SysQI and the model for improvement. So we found staff training in PDSA1 much more challenging because of a very small target patient group. But when we extended it across the whole unit, it became much more easy to apply that training at scale. So we're continuing our PDSA cycles until we can recover ground on that balancing measure, the URR, the quality of dialysis. But we're also collecting these alongside process measures, Ward 31 electricity use, water plant water use, water plant electricity use, and how much chemical consumables we're actually eating our way through. Now, the carbon footprinting tool that we'll be using will be that of susqi.org, and there's a link there for you. To see if we actually achieve any substantive carbon savings. But even if we don't, what we have gained though is a cautionary tale, a cautionary case study for the wider renal community. This may not be the quick fix that the renal community expects. So in summary, environmental breakdown does represent the greatest challenge faced by humankind ever. New skill sets are needed to meet these coming upheavals, and applying the principles of SysQI is just one of these skills. So I'd recommend that you ask yourself, are future patients and the population at large represented in the decisions that you're making on your unit? Does your discipline or specialty have national aims and strategy that you can link your local aims to? And lastly, are there any opportunities to wedge sustainability into other areas of your work, other types of QI, procurement, for instance? And remember, just as a final note, QI and SUS-QI are not separate entities. I'd obviously like to thank the following and yourselves for your attention. I'd be happy to receive any questions.
Thanks so much, Soren. I've learned an awful lot in a very short amount of time. So very grateful for that. I'm conscious of we're just on the 30 minutes, but I'd really like to open this up to the audience because I think it's been an incredibly helpful presentation. I love the fact that you've obviously really taken that PDSA approach and, you know, found probably some unintended consequences or things that you potentially weren't thinking of, which is why I think the PDSA is so valuable when we do this. And actually, you've got a lot of measurement there as well. So, you know, I think that really advocates why we do this. And I think you've really hit home the message about, you know, sustainability and QI being sort of one in the same. And I think James is on the call. We have done some integrated training sessions with teams where we have embedded a QI approach, but it's very much been about sustainable opportunity. So I think we absolutely need to do more of that and really get the message that this is one in the same. So I'm going to open it up very quickly. Have we got any comments or any particular questions that people would like to ask? You're getting a lot of really nice comments there, Soren, in terms of the presentation. Anything from anybody? Ian?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Soren. Thanks, Sarah. I guess, yeah, the thing for me is that you can really use QI through two lenses for this sort of stuff. It's utilising, as you've so eloquently described, Soren, QI to support a project with that sustainable focus. But as Sarah highlighted with the Hadrian Toileting Programme, the fact that somebody can use QI with a patient outcome focus, but actually have that thought around, so what impact is this on environmental sustainability as well? So I really do like the fact that we can shine a light and look at those through those two lenses.
Okay, just to flag as well that Sarah has put some information on about the sorry, put my teeth in, the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. There are a lot of resources on there because one of the things you identified, Saran, was about the skill set. And I think there are a lot of us who aren't quite clear how we measure some of the impacts from a sustainable perspective. And I definitely think that is an area that we probably need to work on and strengthen in the sort of coming months and years. But there are some really helpful resources on that site. And I know obviously James Dixon and the sustainable team are incredibly helpful at supporting these particular projects as well. If there is no other questions, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. A big thanks to Sarah and Soren. That's been really, really interesting in terms of, you know, the work that you've done. And I think we can very much see your passion, Soren. So I hope you will be happy to come back at a future time and give us a bit of an update on where you and the team are at.
No, it'd be a great pleasure. I'm coming back at 5 o'clock anyway, but it'll be a repeat performance.
I didn't mean that quickly.
No, we'll have it nailed by 5.
Lovely. That's what we like to hear. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.